Jesus said that He came to give us life and life more abundantly. But so many times Christians seem to be struggling and missing out on this abundant living. Why is that? How can you come up to His higher standard of living and enjoy the abundant life Jesus promised? That's coming up next as Arkansas Live starts right now. I want to read to you again something the Lord said to me a few years ago, and I wrote it down. And, of course, I read you a paraphrase of this yesterday. God said, "Remind my people that this is the time of their expected end. Thus I will do for them what they have not been able to do for themselves. However, you must not take this time for granted and let your faith rest." Faith was never designed to rest. You were, but not your faith. Faith is a servant, and it was designed by God. He imparted it to you at the time of salvation. He intended for you to use it 24/7. To the contrary, what I shall do for you will increase your faith. So now's not a time to let your faith rest. Now's a time to continue using your faith. You should always have a faith project. Not something that you conjured up, but ask the Lord, "Lord, what do you want me to do now?" When the Lord told me it was time to transition the pastorate of our church to my successor, I asked the Lord, I'm so glad I did this, but I asked the Lord, I said, "Okay, what's my next assignment?" I wasn't looking for retirement. Still not. I was looking for my next assignment. And He told me. He said, "Your next assignment, yours is a television ministry." Well, we had built the first TV station, put it on the air in 1988. We'd added other stations to it. And now through the miracle of live stream and Roku and technology, we're reaching the whole world from right here in Arkansas. So the ministry has not diminished, it has increased. And He said, "Yours is a television ministry." So that was my next assignment. I'm still in that assignment right now. And believe you me, it takes faith to keep operating in that ministry calling. Well, in Ephesians 3 and verse 20, it says that the power that worketh in us, God is going to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. The same power that He wrought in Christ. Let me make some statements to you. If you're taking notes, write these down. Satan's greatest fear is that the church will be obedient to his power. Think about it. Satan is not threatened by your sense of community. I know a lot of churches teach this. Community good, to do good in the community. That's all part of it. That's your outreach. That's a blessing. But Satan's not afraid. Any organization can do good to the community, but Satan's not afraid of that power. He's not threatened by a sense of community service. He's not threatened by your personal journey. I know a lot of people are consumed by their personal journey. He is threatened by you using the power that God's given you. He as long as you remain powerless, Satan's not bothered at all. He'll let you do all the good works and good things that you want to do. But now is your time of the demonstration of Satan's defeat. Colossians 2 said you've been translated out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of God's dear Son, the kingdom of light. So it's not time to rest. It's not time to sit idly by. It's time to take your next assignment And now's the time of your expected end to demonstrate Satan's defeat. You know, in Ephesians 5:14 through 17, it says, buy up for yourselves opportunity. Think about it. Get out there in the marketplace. What opportunity is there? Buy up for yourselves opportunity. We must use our time wisely. Keep the right proportion between secular and spiritual duties. And when I use that word duty, I'm not talking about a false sense of responsibility. But keep a proper and a right proportion of your secular and spiritual assignment. Now, let's move on. I want to deal with the rest of these things that I started yesterday. A higher standard of health, a higher standard of wealth. And I mentioned this several years ago as I've taught along these lines of prosperity. Anybody can prosper by buying wholesale and selling retail. It's not hard to prosper. Anybody can make a profit by buying wholesale and selling retail. I mean, you go to the local market and you buy a sack of oranges and you pay, 20 cents a piece for them, and you go out and you sell those oranges for 40 cents a piece. That's a profit. You've made a profit. You've doubled your money. You can make an income. You can prosper by buying low, selling high, buying wholesale, selling retail. But if you want to create wealth, you have to make investments. Creating wealth is different than prospering. Actually, creating wealth means that you are creating wealth by investments for a second and third generation. You know, if you prosper, anybody can do that. You can work, get paid, you can buy wholesale, sell retail. But if you want to create wealth, then you have to make investments and you have to create that wealth for at least 2 to 3 generations. Proverbs says a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Did you get that? 3 generations. Your children's children. My father taught me this also when I was growing up. He didn't sit down and have a class and teach me, but he taught me, he modeled it. He showed me what he was doing. He told me long before he died, he called my sister and I in and he said, son, I want to show you what I've done in my life financially. And I was, of course, the oldest, and he wanted me to see his will, his trust fund, and all that kind of stuff. And he said, when I die, there's a disbursement out of my trust fund to you and your sister, and then another trust fund. My mother, his wife, our mother had died many years before, and he had remarried. He said, there's a trust fund for my wife, Caldwell Family Trust Fund, and he said that will also come to you when she dies. Well, both of them have died, and there was a disbursement out of these trust funds. He said, now, if you're smart, he said, you will leave the trust fund alone. And, of course, every quarter I get a report from the trust fund manager. Well, I don't anymore because the funds don't exist anymore, because they've both died and they've both been dispersed. But he said, if you're smart, you'll leave that trust fund alone and let it go to your children and your children's children. What was he doing? He was creating wealth. And he learned that from a Jewish friend that he had, that he was in business with on the side. Daddy was vice president of a corporation, and he also had a business with a friend of his, a Jewish man. And they invested their money, and his Jewish business friend told him, he said, now, The way we Jews keep hold of our money and pass it from one generation to the next is with a trust fund. That way, no, the government can't get it, and no child can squander it because they don't ever get the trust fund. They can live off the interest of it. They can borrow against it, but they can't ever get the capital. The principal. So that's what my dad did. So that trust fund stays intact. I told my son just a few weeks ago, I made a disbursement out of it to him. He's still living, of course. I'm still living. I didn't want him to have to wait until I died before he could benefit from it. So I just blessed him real good and sent him a check. What have I done? I'm doing what my father taught me, to create wealth for at least 2 or 3 generations. Now, my father went one step further, and he said in his will that this fund would go to his children or his children's children, including any adopted children. Wow, that's pretty strong. Of course, the adoption laws in the state of Arkansas are in line with the Bible. To adoption means to be literally placed as a son or a daughter. And that's what the laws of Arkansas adoption laws are. And when you adopt a child in Arkansas, the original birth certificate is sealed, can never be retrieved unless by a court order. And the adopted child is issued a new birth certificate with new birth parents. So even if the child has the birth certificate, the original parents are not listed as birth parents. The adopted parents are listed as birth parents. That child becomes the legal heir of the estate or inheritance of his or her parents, which is exactly in line with the Scriptures. So my father included any adopted children in case any of us ever adopted any children. They would be listed as heirs according to his will. I'm telling you all that to show you that he understood through his Jewish business friend what it meant to create wealth. To create wealth is not for you. It's not for yourself. It's for your heirs. This is a higher way of thinking. Okay, that's what we're talking about. A higher standard. This is a higher way of thinking than the natural way of thinking. The natural way of thinking is work hard, get all you can all you get, and sit on the can. That's basically the way most people think. But a higher standard, a higher way of thinking is God's way. He said a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. So creating wealth means that you're not creating it for yourself. You're creating it for others. You can create. I know before I got married, my sister got married. I wasn't married, didn't have any children, but my sister got married, and she had her first child, a little boy. He is now a young man. He is an ER doctor at Baptist in North Little Rock. He's a physician. And I wanted to do something for her and for him. So I don't remember the amount, but I bought a savings bond or something. I bought something for him when he was born. That was over 40 years ago. So I started then to just bless her and bless him. That's creating wealth. I ran across in my childhood box of things, when my mother died, I went up in the attic, and she died in 1968. I wasn't even a Christian. And I went up in the attic, and I got the box that contained all of her letters that she wrote Daddy overseas when he was in the war, World War II, and pictures they sent each other and letters they wrote each other. My first birthday card, 1-year birthday card, my first little outfit. Oh, it was pitiful looking. Shorts and a shirt like a little old Fauntleroy. And I was just so blessed by all of that. And I ran across my first year birthday card, and it had a $5 silver certificate safety pinned to the envelope. Now, silver certificates were recalled years ago. They don't use silver certificates anymore. They use Federal Reserve notes. But in that box, I also found I don't know what the denomination was, $25, $50, savings bond, war bond, that she had purchased. Of course, back in the war days, they encouraged people to buy war bonds to help fund the war. And she bought one in my name, and it was there in that box all these years. And I was amazed that she thought that far ahead because, oh my Lord, when we lived with my grandmother, my mother's parents, while my dad was overseas, a lot of people did that in those days. Their husbands were gone, so they moved in with their parents. And, you know, we were so poor we couldn't pay attention. I mean, there was no... My aunt told me, my dad's youngest sister. I was talking to her one day. She's still living. She's 93 years old. And I said, tell me about my dad, my mom, our family when we were little, when Daddy came home from the war. She laughed. She said, oh, my goodness. She said, I was a teenager. I was wanting to get married myself. She said, I didn't pay too much attention to anybody else. I was wanting a husband, blah, blah, blah. But she said, your mother and father were very poor. Well, that was a shock to me because I never knew we were poor. I asked my mother one time, are we poor? She said, no, we have love. Therefore, we're not poor. She looked at the world through rose-colored glasses. She was always upbeat. She'd throw up the shades every morning. This is the day the Lord hath made, and we'll rejoice and be glad in it. And we couldn't even, afford gasoline. We couldn't afford a loaf of bread. Well, gasoline was rationed. But my aunt told me, she said, your mom and dad were very poor. But she said they were also very determined. And they made it through the Great Depression as kids, and they made it through the Second World War. And my dad became a very successful, prosperous businessman. But he didn't know what I know today. He just knew if you worked hard and saved. And he saved, and they conserved. They didn't spend a lot. I mean, our first house, my dad told me, the total house cost of buying a two-bedroom house, and he added a bedroom to it, was $7,500. That was for the whole house, $7,500. And he had to have $500 down payment, and he didn't have $500. He asked his daddy if he could borrow from me. He said no. So he asked my mother's daddy, his father-in-law, and he said yes, and he gave him the $500. So they started out at the bottom with the barrel on top of them, and then he gradually, stepped up, got better jobs, made more money, invested it. He was very frugal, but he was also investing for the future. He was creating wealth. I said a whole lot here in a short period of time to get you to see that God has a higher standard. And creating wealth is part of that higher standard. The blessing maketh rich, and he adds no sorrow to it. The tithe is the Lord's and belongs to the Lord. That's 10% of your increase. And then Galatians 6, 7, and 8 says that if you give, it'll be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together. Luke 6:38, Galatians 6, 7. Don't be deceived. God's not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. And even though Daddy started out poor and didn't have anything, didn't own a car, when he came home from the war, he took the streetcar. The streetcar is similar to the one that runs through the river market, only these were very primitive. I enjoyed riding them because they were fun to me. But my daddy had to ride one to work. And sometimes they weren't running, and sometimes they'd get off the track. And the men would have to push the thing and get it back on the track. And it had electric leads that were on a wire over them, and then it had rails that it ran on. And Herbert Jones was a friend of my family. He started and owned Jones Motor Company out on University. Jones Isuzu, whatever it was, he sold. The first line of cars he sold was Nash Ambassador, Nash Rambler. Remember the old Nash? It looked like a big old boat. He gave my father a car. It was a Nash Rambler station wagon. I'll never forget it. And we lived on Martin Street, and it had a driveway that was like this. So Daddy parked it up the top of the driveway. Next morning he was going to drive it to work, and he worked out at U.S. Time Corporation. I'm giving you a lot of history. At the airport, the slab, the foundation that U.S. Time Corporation was on is still there. Everything else has been bulldozed. And they made Mickey Mouse and Pluto watches. This was Timex. And Dad was the purchasing agent. And he got up to go to work, and the car wouldn't start. So he rolled it down the driveway, kick-started it, and drove to work. Came after work, went out to the car, and he had a flat tire. So he changed the flat tire. And on the way home, he ran out of gas. And he called Herbert, and he said, Herbert, I really appreciate you giving me this car, but would you please come get it? I can't afford to drive it. So he gave the car back because he couldn't afford to drive it. So that's how poor we were. Yet he continually invested, saved. He believed. And he tapped into this higher way of prosperity. He started creating wealth. And he was generous. He put my sister and I through college. I went 2 years and then went in the Navy. She went 4 years, graduated from the University of Arkansas. So he wanted to buy my mother a refrigerator because we had an ice box that you put ice in. He wanted to buy her a washing machine. And later on, he wanted to buy her a color TV set. She didn't want any of it. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't old enough to have a say-so, but she didn't want any of it because she was raised with a poverty mindset. So was Daddy, but he was outgrowing it. There's a higher way, and when you tap into that higher way, you supersede that lower way. So maybe I said all that just to encourage you. There's a higher standard of spirituality. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. The gifts of the Spirit. You know, Paul said to the Corinthian church, I would not have you ignorant concerning these gifts. These gifts will bring you into a higher level of spirituality. And then over in Philippians 3, the Apostle Paul said, this is where he said, he pressed toward the mark for the prize, the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. There's a race to be run, a crown to be won. You cannot stand still. Don't let anybody take your crown. There is a divine order, a higher way of thinking. Let me say this. If you're taking notes, write it down. There is a divine order. That's God's order. That is a higher standard. And this higher standard is so the world will see and recognize God's presence and power. You know, in 1 Corinthians 2, we didn't read this the other day. We could probably go over there and read it today. There is a benefit, there's a reward, there is a visible, tangible award of doing things God's way, a higher standard. Listen to the Apostle Paul before he got ready to minister to the Corinthians. He said in 1 Corinthians 2, Brethren, when I came to you, I came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom, declaring unto you the testimony of God. I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I was with you in weakness and fear and much trembling. You might be experiencing the same thing right now, whatever the reason. And my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom. Here it is. But in the demonstration of the Spirit and power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Here's the reason for it. Now, my statement to you was, there is a divine order, a higher way, and there is a human way of thinking. There's a divine way, and there's a human way. And the purpose for the higher way, the higher standard, is so the world will see and recognize God's power. When the Lord told us to build our church, He told us to build it and pay for it as we went, not to borrow the money. Well, it took us a couple of years to do it, but when we were done, we were done. There was no mortgage on it. And we built it and paid for it as we went. It was a supernatural challenge. But God said, if you can't build a building, you can't take a city. And if you can't take a city, I've got to get somebody else. Well, there was a bank, a local banker, and the president of the bank came out and he said, I'll gladly loan you the money. I know you're a contractor and we've done business before. I said, well, I can't because the Lord told me not to. He told us to build it by faith. He just kind of looked at me. When we were done, he came out to see what we built. He walked around and he said, you know, I never would have thought you could do this without us. That was a supernatural testimony of a higher way of thinking. And that brought glory to God. Not against borrowing money. You can do whatever you want to do, whatever the Lord tells you to do. But the supernatural way supersedes the natural way. The human way of thinking is under the higher way of thinking. So I challenge you, and we'll continue with this tomorrow, to come up to God's way. It's a higher way. Remember, Jesus is Lord of Arkansas, and wherever you're watching in the world, too.
Send your questions, comments, and testimonies to Happy Caldwell at Post Office Box 26207, Little Rock, Arkansas 72221, or email happycaldwell@vtntv.com. Remember to follow VTN on Facebook at VTN Your Arkansas Christian Connection, and follow Happy Caldwell on Twitter at Happy_Caldwell. VTN is on Roku. Search VTN in the channel store and add us to your lineup. Today's episode is available to watch on demand at VTNTV.com and click Watch. You can also watch VTN via live stream at VTNTV.com.